All right, welcome everybody, and thank you so much for being here. I think this is our fifth lecture of the spring series. So we have at least four more. So I hope you take advantage of those. Also, we have our Neighborhoods of New Orleans class, which will be taking up a lot of our time in May. If you've never participated in that, it's an unbelievable class where we basically break down the whole all sections of New Orleans and how they're studied and how they developed and formed and everything like that. It's 5 weeks, about 10 hours of class time, and we even do the suburbs areas of New Orleans, which is always one of the favorite of everybody is doing what's considered the suburbs of New Orleans. So I hope you take advantage of that. Next week we have our last of April. We have Howard Phillips Smith, who's going to be doing. He has a brand new book on George Deroe and his life and times in New Orleans. So I hope you take advantage of that. But tonight we're going to be talking about Filipino culture. I'm very excited to have Professor of English at University of Louisiana Lafayette, Dr. Randy Gonzalez, and he's going to be talking about Filipino Louisiana and the influences they had on the state. And I want to welcome Randy and thank you so much for being here, Randy.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here and kind of share the story of Filipino Louisiana and read some poetry to you because this is the book that I wrote, Settling St. Malo, is poetry. Um, it um, it didn't start out that way, but it ended up that way. And the reason was that I was writing a nonfiction book about the history. First of all, I'm not a history professor. I consider myself a community historian. And then, second, there's just a lot of gaps in the story. And I found that I was writing poetry on the side. And then, so I kind of want to, I'll give you the history, of course, but I'll interrupt sometimes and just go and read a poem and then see and let you hear what this documentary type of poetry sounds like. Always like to get started by starting out why I do this. This is my grandmother, and this is my father over here to the left, and this is my aunts and uncle. And I didn't know a lot about the Filipino community in New Orleans, even though I knew I was Filipino. And so one day, my grandmother, I was showing her a book about Filipinos in Louisiana, and she looked at the book and she's like, "Oh yeah, this is me in this Mardi Gras float. Here is Daddy's bar back there," and there was this whole world opened up, and I was just shocked that I didn't know these stories. And Granny couldn't really fill in all of the gaps, so I started doing my own research basically, and that was years and years ago. Eventually led me to kind of researching the larger Filipino community in Louisiana. When we talk about the immigrant communities, it's important to look at the migration phases. So this is kind of we're looking at. I'm going to first look at the earlier settlers, and this is the pre 1898. Now, 1898 was when the U.S. became, occupied the Philippines, right? The Spanish American War, and the US took possession of the Philippines. So before that, there weren't really many Filipinos in the United States, but a lot of them that were here were in Louisiana. And it's mainly because of the port, right? There are Filipinos in other ports. There are Filipinos who, fought in the Civil War. Mainly Filipinos were working on ships and ended up staying in port areas. But in Louisiana, they started communities. Okay, so you have to think about this time period when this is the Spanish Empire, and the Philippines and Louisiana were both in the Spanish Empire at the same time. I just found an old map that shows Texas as New Philippines, right? Because they were looking for names. The name Texas eventually stuck, but this is all part of the Spanish territory, as you know. So Louisiana was this kind of the borderland at this point from 1763 to 1801 of the Spanish Empire. So the early Filipinos, I keep saying, I keep calling them the early Filipino settlers, right? The people who came here, settled here, and started the community. St. Malo is considered the first permanent Filipino settlement in the United States, and it was established early in the 19th century. The dates that we know of are 1830s and probably destroyed somewhere around 1915. Destroyed many, many times in the process, but people stopped living out there probably around 1915. The dates are uncertain. We just don't know. You might have seen earlier dates online. Those dates we just don't know when Filipinos first settled Saint Malo. What we do know about Saint Malo largely comes from this Times Democrat exhibition expedition, sorry, that traveled to the village in 1883. Now this happened. When we think about, I have the map here because we think about going to St. Malo now and we just drive down to Shell Beach and get on a boat. Well, in those days, they were traveling by boat from Bayou St. John, right? So making that long trip. To the reporters that went down there, this seemed like an expedition to a whole nother world. And it was kind of written that way. So we have this very Orientalist lens upon St. Malo, looking at Filipinos from the outside. And sometimes it can be difficult to kind of understand the culture from the inside when much of what is written about St. Malo comes from the outside. And this is one of the problems I found when writing this book, that I would say was realizing that, oh, they're seeing this, but what's really happening, right? What's really happening at St. Malo that they're not seeing? What is it? How are they interpreting what's happening there into, into, is there a different reality? So we were kind of stuck with these kind of stories about Saint Malo. So as you look at these pictures, so when in 1883 expedition, the they drew these pictures, right? An artist was out there, drew the buildings, and then these were then sent up to Harper's Weekly, and they made an imprint of them. So I'd like you to look at them, and I'm going to read a little bit from the book. And this is kind of the descriptions, based on the descriptions of these when people first went to St. Malo. When Manila men fished at St. Malo, bayou, village, island, with no clear western shore, patches of marsh, lagoons, and canals unraveling into the Gulf. From the lake, you see miles of flooded rushes laid out before a chenier. Narrow ridge, sand and shell plowed up by storm surges, forested with live oaks. Until you clear a slash of wind-sculpted willows do you notice stilted structures, where men have claimed patches of marsh. From the lake, the landscape is all Louisiana. Wet prairie of swaying sawgrass, cane scratching into low clouds, scatter of pouldew, darting teal, still frames of egrets postured in shallows. Plain of water ripples as shrimp pop from the course of pursuing redfish. Past the mouth, the bayou turns Asiatic. Hat-shaped eaves strung with smoked fish, cocks clamoring at domed cages, squat men examining seines. Mile after mile more cypress, buildings all stained in moss, more fishermen tending to task, without a nod to your passing. So in my documentary poetry, a lot of the phrases and some of the words are, come from the articles that were written about the area. And so there was a very romantic perception, right, of this kind of Louisiana landscape with Filipinos out there, fishing and living their life. And there was a lot of misinformation. So there's a poem, and then so there's some of the great stories that come out of there are, I say great in the sense of interesting folklore, right? Of how people would how Filipinos were tying people to stakes, how Filipinos had trained mosquitoes to bite the white people that went out there. These stories, these kind of that were created to create fear about the community, and to kind of say why others couldn't live out there. So there's one poem called Lafcadio Hearn. Lafcadio Hearn discovers a Malay village, transported to the marsh whole cloth, minus the rule and order of Spain, minus women, an absence engendering morbid curiosity, if not envy. Hearn wrote about the urban fear of wetlands, the unpredictable storms, insects, and alligators, and anyone sturdy enough to inhabit such a wilderness. Civil society perpetuated the lure of uncivilized Malays, told of men who tie you to a stake so mosquitoes and green-headed horseflies could suck at your flesh. Some claim stakes mere effect, mosquitoes the real threat, not your average insect, an intelligent species trained to attack those of a lighter complexion. First the customs agent, then tax collectors, and of course anyone who would fish their waters. A sting meant a fever of the rankest kind, if not death, a clear warning never to return. So the pictures that you're looking at, the illustrations here, are of St. Malo at 1883. Now, when St. Malo was first established, it was palmetto rooftops, small little huts on the banks of Bayou St. Malo. But what happened in between was ice. And it was the ice that allowed fish to be brought to New Orleans in larger batches and stay fresh. So imagine in 18 prior to the 1860s, without ice in New Orleans. Remember that track I mentioned about going from Bayou St. John to the southern shore of Lake Borgne. Now, the way that people brought fish to market were in those fish carts, right? Basically live wells where fish were in the water. And they dragged these behind the boats, behind the luggers. If they did that and they went from St. Malo through the Wrigley's, through Lake Pontchartrain into Bayou St. John, almost all of the fish were dead. And the reason was that the salination rate changed as you moved up into through the Wrigley's into the lake and into Bayou St. John. But with ice, you can now transport fish into those same spaces. And you could put fish on the train that would run from Shell Beach or Proctorville, as it was called then, to New Orleans. So with that, Filipinos were basically sitting on this gold mine of fish that they could then use, they could sell to the markets of New Orleans and basically build these large structures you see now. So with that also came, some a little bit of wealth and also part and kind of being part of the New Orleans community, right? This one of the first chartered Filipino or Asian American community organization in the United States was in New Orleans, and it was established in 1872, and it was called the Hispano Filipino Benevolent Society. And they have a tomb at St. Vincent de Paul number 2. My great grandfather is in one of those, you know, um, what do you call those? Those little slots there in one of those tombs. And so this society basically connected the St. Malo to New Orleans, and then what followed was a lot of businesses springing up around the seafood industry. So the earliest settlers, they married local women, so Creole, sometimes Italian, Cajun, sometimes Black, and indigenous. So married basically the women of the area. Um, but their daughters of these marriages married Philippine-born men, right? So all of the women in these photos are second gener or half Filipino and half either Italian, Creole, half something else. But the husbands here were all born in the Philippines. So this was kind of the pattern that kept the Filipino community strong and kept this identity of Filipino community several generations in. There were a number of entrepreneurs. So most people, they were coming here for fishing and shrimping. That was the industry that allowed them to build some wealth. But there were entrepreneurs like Quentin de la Cruz who established Manila Village. Juan Rojas, who had Clark Chenier, another kind of shrimp drying platform, and then he entered into the fur trading business as well. The platform villages were different from St. Malo because in Bayou Barataria, Filipinos could, there was a connection to New Orleans. Steamboats would go in the area. So families would actually live out here in Bayou Barataria. And this, again, families were established and living on places like Clark Chenier. Here's an example of one of these platform villages where they would dry shrimp. The dried shrimp industry um, was basically the precursor to the shrimp industry we have now, right? You know, shrimp being dried allowed them to be exported around the country and to markets, in particularly in China. Um, Louisiana dried shrimp are particularly have a lot of keratin. Louisiana shrimp have a lot of keratin, so when they dry them, they're very orange. You can tell the difference between Louisiana dried shrimp and dried shrimp from other regions because of how orange Louisiana dried shrimp are, and this made them more valuable in the markets. And so there was a huge export, you know, industry of sending out dry shrimp. So I want to read this poem, When Filipinos Dried Shrimp in Louisiana. Shrimp drying platforms, Manila Village, Basa Basa, Chung Fat, Fifi Island, Camp Dewey, Quang Sun, Petit Caillou, Clark Chenier, and more. Acres of cypress plank, each built over a low island, each factory and village, each community. Starts with fingers strong and agile enough to weave seines fine enough to harvest shrimp. Then luggers and labor to stretch nets down the coast. Filipino, yes, Chinese, Spanish, French, Italian, Croatians, Japanese, Mexican, African American, Native American, Creole, and Cajuns populated over 100 platforms scattered across Barataria Bay. So part of this process of the shrimp drying was this what they call dancing the shrimp. And they had to step on the shrimp. So when the shrimp were dry, they still had their shells on them. So they marched across the shrimp to remove the to to remove the shell. Basically, the shell was so dry it would powder and it would create this kind of bran that was then used in fertilizer. But they were able to separate the shrimp from the flesh from the shell but through this process. Every culture that was down there seems to claim this dancing of the shrimp. Filipinos will say they invented it. The Cajuns will say they invented it. It really doesn't matter, but it was just one of the processes for removing the shell. So here's a poem called Dancing the Shrimp. Production began with a boil. Baskets of shrimp dipped into brick-lined vats of brine, then spread across 100-yard cypress deck. Raised so the breeze rustled marsh grass, whistled between boards. In 3 days of salt air, Louisiana sun, 105 pounds of shrimp curled to 15. Yet not done. Attendants rake cured crustaceans in preparation for the dance. Burlap covered feet waltz exoskeletons. Each turn more firm flesh as shells dust to bran. No missteps. Guitar or not, they marched, slid tired, jubilant feet across orange fields. We're making a documentary based on this book, and we just recorded this scene with in inside and not with real shrimp, but we had some dust flying. It was a fun scene to record, but it's this idea of dancing the shrimp has always been kind of it's just so interesting, and people really are intrigued by it. So the next major migration phase came in 1898 into 1935 when Filipinos were considered U.S. nationals, right? So Filipinos were free to settle in the U.S. So without any, basically could just sail over it and set roots here. And of course, Filipinos joined the U.S. Navy at this point. My great grandfather came to the U.S. in 1908 with the U.S. Navy. He joined the Great White Fleet when it was stationed in the Philippines, and basically sailed around the world with the Navy, and then came here and eventually settled in Louisiana. So this is the Philippine American War, and this is when Philippines was became a U.S. colony. This is that period. Um, you know the so what happens during this period is Filipinos start moving to New Orleans in greater numbers because they're working on ships, and because Filipinos are coming with the Navy on merchant ships and deciding to settle in New Orleans, more businesses pop up, and to support the industry basically of Filipinos. Um, so we get a number of entrepreneurs. One that we know of is Mr. and Mrs. Pedro Rosilio. Pedro Rosilio he was a restaurateur. So he had a restaurant, but he went from working in the fish trade to opening a restaurant. Um, and in his obituary, the newspaper wrote that it was one of the finest foreign restaurants in New Orleans. Now, I'm not sure what a foreign restaurant means in New Orleans, but and I don't know exactly what kind of food was served at this restaurant, but it was, whether it was foreign in the sense that it had Spanish food, or was it foreign in the sense that it was Filipino or Asian. I'm not quite sure, and I'm trying to doing a little more research on that. But when he died, his wife, who was half Filipino, started a boarding house, or they had a boarding house, but she kind of expanded it. And the boarding houses were important for the sailors that came to town because it helped them to connect with the community. My great grandfather, who was with the Navy, he brought his whole family, and they stayed at this boarding house for close to a year until they settled in. He got a good job, or he got a job. He got a job as a prohibition agent in New Orleans. I don't think it was the best job. He was an undercover prohibition agent, but he had a job, and they were able to move the family out of the boarding house. So this is kind of these smaller businesses we start to see: restaurants, Filipinos working in stalls, or were having stalls in the French market, and connecting to the shrimp drying areas, and bringing shrimp and oysters from Barataria Bay and selling them in the marketing and open restaurants around that. Still trading down Bayou St. John. So the community is kind of building along the waterways. Um, and this led to a number of community organizations, um, having Mardi Gras parades, having a number of events to connect the community with the city. So a large part of the community was the outreach and to share some information about Filipinos, and also in some ways at this during these earlier days was to promote the idea that the Philippines should be independent. So there was a large anti-imperialist movement in the United States, and Filipinos were part of that movement. And even though many of the men served in the Navy, there was this pull, like basically the argument was that imperialism is un-American, right? This is not who we are as a nation. And so to be strongly and patriotically American, but say that we shouldn't be, the Philippines should be freed. One way the Filipino community connected with New Orleans was through Mardi Gras. They held Mardi Gras balls. They had a Mardi Gras float. Um, the first float was in the Elks Crew of Our Legions parade, and this is one of the earliest. They were in the first Elks parade. But the ball was a big thing. And one of the queens of the ball had a diary. Now, this diary has been a wealth of information for me because she went to my great grandfather's bar. So my great grandfather was the one in the Navy, the one who was a prohibition agent, and after prohibition, he opened a bar. It's a very New Orleans thing to do. And she went to the bar quite frequently, which I'm happy about, as she even went to my great grandfather's funeral. So we have this story of life in New Orleans through her diary, and it was one of those 5-year diaries. So she only wrote like 2 sentences every day, and those sentences kind of tell a story that's important. And you can kind of see the patterns. This is happening during World War II. So you can see what's happening in New Orleans. There's a lot of references to things that are going on there. So I'm just going to read a little bit of it. It's a long poem. When we drank at the Filipino colony bar, spent the day in town, went to a parade, then a dance, had a good time. Hugo's ship came in. We went to the colony bar. Nick treated us plenty. Went to Charlie's place for Filipino music. Had a real good time. Toby got a ship out of Mobile. Mr. Johnny and an American fellow were about to fight. The boys from California left. Wasn't any crowd at all. Came home early. Went to Lafitte Cemetery. Just like a summer day. Drank beer, got sunburnt. Went to the Colony Bar. Had a good time. Went to Canal Street. Bought my wedding outfit. Got home late from the Colony Bar. Everybody a good time. Hugo and I went to the show. Saw This Land Is Mine. Today, Hugo and I got married. Everybody a good time. We all went to the colony. Billy and his boys played. Everybody danced. Rained almost all day. Skipped the carnival ball. Took a walk to the colony bar. Wasn't any crowd at all. We left early. So this poem goes on and kind of goes through a lot of her experiences and kind of shows this kind of relationship the Filipino community had with the river, with ships coming in and out, and just in with New Orleans itself as she goes through and works through some of the industries. She worked in a shrimp factory. She worked, you know, turning oyster bags. We see her go out to Little Woods to go to the camps, to go to West End to eat crabs. It's just kind of a very fascinating story. And the only reason we have this diary is because she eventually moved to California and it was not caught up in any of our floods. So this is one of the problem with the community. We just don't have much, so we have to kind of pull the kind of fragments of these stories together into something that we understand, and give some kind of sense of the fuller story. And again, that's why I ended up writing poetry, because there's just so little to kind of fill it in. So here's the Mardi Gras float. This was the 1935 float, and it won the best decorated. The story. This is the photo I showed to my grandmother in the book, and she looked at it and she was like, "Oh yeah, that's my sister right behind the Filipino flag, and I'm on here somewhere." And then she went looking for herself. This is 1935, and what's important about this float is that there's Uncle Sam is on the back side, and next to him is a Filipina, and she is wearing traditional Filipino clothes, um, but she has chains around her wrists. This is that idea of independence. And Uncle Sam has the big scissors ready to free. All right. This is shortly after an agreement, the Tidings-McDuffie Act agreed to free Filipinos. So the community was quite happy about this. We see, but we see this kind of very Filipino American presence. The Navy's represented the United States as a Filipino man, and this guy's dressed as this Filipino everyman, Juan de la Cruz. But the problem with this situation was that the Tidings-McDuffie Act promised independence for the Philippines, but U.S. nationals became aliens. So people like my great grandfather, a lot of those men that I said that served in the Navy, their status was uncertain. They had no idea what was going to happen to them, right? So they basically they had no legal status in the United States, even though they lived there for 30, 40 years. They just couldn't, they didn't know what was going to happen. The community did not really realize this when they celebrated Mardi Gras. And it didn't really affect them too much until 1936, when the Merchant Marine Act was signed and Filipinos were considered foreigners, and only a certain amount of foreigners could work on ships. And so this act basically, so full ships where you might have 30 Filipinos working on it, now only 5 could work on the ship. So a lot of them lost jobs. And so there's this huge effort to try and get back, these jobs. Eventually, by 1946, with the Luceller Act, Filipinos were given access to U.S. citizenship. But there's a 10-year gap there, and there was a lot of uncertainty. That uncertainty, the good thing about uncertainty is people get galvanized and they write letters, and we learn more of the history. So I learned about my great grandfather, Miguel Galera, through a lot of the letters that he wrote about his citizenship. He he had applied for citizenship when he finished when he left the U.S. Navy. He thought he had it, but he had no documentation. So he's writing these letters to the U.S. government. And these part of these letters are in the book because they kind of tell an interesting story of um, of his life as a Filipino in the United States. Many of the military records I looked at were very thin, but his was really fat because he wrote back and forth to the government, and he worked for the government after. So it wasn't just military. He worked for the post office, he worked for the prohibition agent. So he worked for a number of government agencies. And he wrote back and forth to the government whenever something came up, or he wanted something, or he wanted a promotion, or whatever it was. So you have this whole stack of letters. Once the government overpaid him $7, and 3 or 4 years later they end up they're tracking him down to get their $7. So we get a lot of interesting information from this occurrence because he's writing letters back like, don't have the money now, sorry. The kids, I need shoes for my kids, it's really cold, and coal is expensive, we need and so there you kind of get these kind of intimate parts of their life because he's writing back to the government. We also have the Filipino Seamen's Association, you know, an organization that's basically writing to the president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and asking for, explaining the situation that Filipinos are in, and all the Filipinos that were working on ships that are unable to find jobs now. So, whenever there's kind of some disruption, we get to learn a lot about people. The kind of everydayness in the history we don't get. We kind of get, and the problem of this kind of when stories aren't told at the table. We kind of have to go back and find them through these documents. So with the Loose Cellar Act in 1946, this is a photo of my grandfather, Enrique Gonzalez. Remember I said, so my grandmother was half Filipino and half English, but as a Filipina, her and her sisters married Filipino men, including, so she married my grandfather, Enrique Gonzalez. Now he got his citizenship in 1946. Unfortunately, my great grandfather had passed away before any of this was clarified. So when he died, everything was kind of in doubt. He didn't know about his legal status, and there was no clarification. So the next major immigration phase really affects a lot of the community today. There are Filipino Americans in Louisiana like me, but when you look at us, you probably don't recognize us as Filipino. And for a large part of my family, it's like, are you sure we're Filipino? So it is we've kind of fully been integrated and assimilated. Post 1965, you know, more Filipinos started coming to Louisiana. Um, we had a large group of teachers. We have Filipinos working on oil rigs. So this is the kind of phase of Filipino migration into the city that got started after 1965, when families come. A lot of Filipinos in nursing and doctors' offices. Um, there's an article about this I wrote for 64 parishes. So if you need to know a little more about this whole kind of migration process. You go look at Filipino Americans on 64 parishes. We're happy to have 64 parishes to share these kind of stories. Um, that's basically it for me today. If you need more, you could get the book for sure. I think you have it at the Cabildo. Um, Also, I manage this website, FilipinoLA.com. Haven't updated it recently, but it tells the story of Filipinos in Louisiana. And you can follow me on my website, randygonzalez.com. I'm working on another book that'll tell the story of Filipino Louisiana through foodways, thinking about what the earlier settlers were eating. And we will have a documentary, hopefully on LPB in the next year or so, that's based off of settling St. Malo. So that's in the works right now.
Randy, I had no idea about this culture to this level and at this extent. It's so impressive. Um, First, congratulations. This is great work, and thank you for educating us on the Filipino American community. It goes back so far. If anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat. I'm gonna kick it off with a couple of questions that I had, and you might have mentioned this at the very beginning, and I'm sorry if I missed it. Why did the U.S. officially why did they have the Philippines in the late 1800s?
So the Spanish American War, right?
That was Spanish American War. Okay.
So the Philippines was Spanish territory. Same Cuba, Puerto Rico, right? All came together as the package. Um, the Filipinos felt particularly betrayed because Filipinos had their own revolution going on at the time and joined with the US to defeat the Spanish with the promise of freedom. And then that didn't come after, right? So there was a Philippine American War that took place that we really don't learn about in schools, where the Philippines was fighting the US.
Oh,
And
wow. So that's very interesting. I'd never heard that before. And obviously, unfortunately, however we look at it, yeah, the US won and we were able to stick our bases over there, which obviously we
yes.
used specific, I mean, a bunch in World War II. My guess is that the Philippines and the US bases semi live in good harmony at this point.
Well, not really, right? The
Okay.
bases were there was a contract to remove the bases, but there's still a U.S. presence. It's always, yeah, there's problems that go around the bases as part of the issue, right? The culture of the bases can be part of the problem of having bases, and so there are some U.S. is in the Philippines in some way, not there's an agreement of some sort. I'm not sure of all the details, but there's always been a kind of push and pull, right?
Gotcha.
That's
Uh,
going.
so I was actually going to ask this question later, but I don't want to bring it up right now since we're talking about this. You spoke about the Filipino American independence movement of the Philippines. So the Philippines. So the people that were living in the United States who were American citizens at the time, right?
Right.
Depending on what year it is. They wanted the Philippines to become independent again. But what was their stance on what they wanted to do? Was it like, we're going to go back to the Philippines? Or they were like, we're
Yeah,
here. We want this. We just want where we came from to be independent of the US. We are Americans. So,
that's right. Yeah, I mean that's within the letters they'll say like look, we're Americans. We have American. I feel I'm American. I have American children. My American children can vote because they're writing to politicians,
yeah,
so they're saying all of these things. And I served the U.S. Navy. I worked for the U.S. government for 20 years. So they're really there's a claim they're not going back. And the earlier settlers weren't really going back either. It's difficult, and they had nothing really to go back to. They left the family that wouldn't be there, right? 30
right,
years later. And they so there is no sense of them returning or desiring to return, but there is this idea of, the place I call home should be free. And there was such an anti-imperialist movement in the United States that it was easy to latch on to that, right? There's the government itself is discussing these things. So it's not like it's a hidden component. There's a lot of talk within newspapers and government about this. So we because we don't learn about it in school, we tend to think that, oh, it's anti-American, but there was a large anti-imperialist movement in the United States, like led by like Mark Twain and people that we, that we know and trust. And so there was this movement, and the US just didn't know what to do with the Philippines. It was kind of an experiment of sorts of being colonial powers, and hardly ever use that word because, in our imagination, America was the colony. We can't be colonizers.
Yeah.
And yeah, so the rhetoric is not, we're protecting, we're uplifting. There was this kind of rhetoric going around
Yeah, and I
thinking.
can imagine that some of the territories we acquired due to the Spanish American War, and although I'm not discounting that it was a difficult task, but to let's just say you have people that move from Puerto Rico and Cuba to the U.S. I mean, we aren't, and I know we're talking about different time. It's you couldn't get on a plane, but still, the idea that you would move from there to the U.S. doesn't seem as extreme as moving from the Philippines to US. I mean, it's a once in a lifetime trip and you're not coming back from it kind of thing for a long time.
Yeah, yeah, people did go back and forth, but it's a month journey,
Yeah,
it's not a hop on the plane and I'll be see you tomorrow like we can do
exactly.
now.
So it just makes you understand how difficult that decision was. And then I'm sure that the independence movement and how they become Americans was a struggle, a mental struggle that they had to kind of work through. Um, You mentioned also about the negative stories about the Filipinos. Um, Newspapers, is that where this is being written?
Yeah, like the Harper, there are lots of newspapers. And so
Gotcha.
you have two things happening. You have people don't know how to place Filipinos, so they're often called Malay, Chinese. There's just no, even census
Okay.
keepers don't know how to place Filipinos. And so you have that component, but you also have this city to wetlands kind of opinion too, right? Like how are people living in this uncivilized space? So you put them together and it's like, oh, well, these Filipinos are living even further out than everyone else. They must be pirates, criminals. There must be a reason, right? And then it's because when Lafcadio and Hearn and them go out there, there's the mosquitoes, there's all kinds of things they just don't want to deal with, right? Because they're
Right.
coming from the city. So it's part of that is that city country thing, right? How do y'all live in this space? And especially with the wetlands and the fear of the wetlands, not knowing what's under that water. Well, Filipinos were seamen. They sailed all over the world. They weren't
Yeah.
scared of Lake Bourne. They sailed the Pacific. They've been, so this was not really an issue for them. But for the average American going out there from New Orleans, say the average New Orleanian going out there, this was like, oh, I can't believe it.
Yeah. It's like, I mean, going to another world kind of thing.
Yeah.
Craig asked, were there any communities of Maroon in St. Malo?
Yes, and this is where I thought about this. Thanks, Craig, for that question because yes, there was a Maroon community before Filipinos were there, and I always want to try and make sure to mention that, right? So we don't forget that story, including Juan Saint Malo, who Saint Malo is named after. And Juan Saint Malo was a plantation raider, right? He raided the plantation and freed slaves, or enslaved people, and brought them. They lived out in what became Saint Malo. And this is one reason we kind of know that Filipinos probably were not living out there at the same time as Juan Saint Malo, because it wouldn't have been a place you wanted to live, because the Spanish were always hunting and looking for for Juan Saint Malo. He was, this area was a kind of a more of a conflict zone in some ways, in that he was wanted, right? So Filipinos wouldn't go and live in the same space at the same time when Juan Saint Malo was being hunted by the Spanish. In my opinion, we're not sure at all, but I don't think it would be the space they would looking for. There were The way the older generation was described, it was like they were just looking for peace, a nice bayou, and some fish and sustenance just to live. They weren't making a lot of money out there initially. They were just living.
Um, Great question, Craig. One final question. At the very end, you were talking about the assimilation, um, and how just in appearance, the assimilation has happened over a period of time. But not speaking to the appearance, but in general, assimilation by Filipinos, how was that thought of within the community? Was it like the ones above didn't want to assimilate? I mean, the older parents didn't want to assimilate, and the kids are moving forward, or is it just like they wanted to assimilate from the very beginning and become part of the country, and they were there, and this is just way 140 years of immigration, and being in a country that's a melting pot.
Well, yeah, we have to think of what's happening in Louisiana at the time and segregation. So there
Hmm.
was no place for brown people. You were either black or white.
Okay.
So that's how assimilation happens, right? They make themselves as white as possible because they don't want to be considered black. And there were actually there were cases where people were like, "No, you're black." My grandmother tells the story of going to my dad's school and saying that, his birth certificate says he's brown, but he's white, and arguing that, and she says, "Look at me," because she was, had an English, her mother was English, she had a whiter complexion.
Yeah.
Look at me, he's white. And so when you have to make these arguments, right, it kind of pushes assimilation and away from this idea of brownness. It's only in the 21st century where people celebrate brown, where being brown was not always, it was something that people were shying away for, and it was because of segregation. People did the society was split, and if you were considered black, you went to a poorer school, you had fewer things. And so the idea of, for a whole generation, there was a push to be white. So
Yeah.
what they wanted or not is hard to say, right? The society wanted something, and they were going to give it to them for them to have their children, and them to have the best opportunity.
Yeah, they were almost in limbo, and that's got to be an uncomfortable feeling. I mean, now you fill out something and it says, "Do you have Hispanic? Or are you Caucasian? Are you Black?" It gives you a list of not a lot, but I mean, but to have just two and you're in the middle, yeah, that's an unusual position that I can find a lot of. I can understand how that could be very difficult for a lot of them.
And this happened with the Italian community as well in New Orleans, right? There was, where initially there was a lot of racism towards Italians, and because of the brown, and so Filipinos and Italians were often lumped together as a minority group and lived in some of the same communities. And so, but this is there is a push to be as white as possible, because that allows you, and then often that's a push away from identity markers, right?
Yeah.
So some things get highlighted, we still hold on to some things, but we lose some other things.
Yeah. Yeah, very interesting. Well, this is a very interesting topic. It sounds like you're doing plenty more research on it. So I look forward to what the next book, the documentary, because honestly, the amount of stories that have got to be in here from 140 years worth of settling. Any idea how many people are in Louisiana that are of Filipino descent?
Yeah, I think we think it's like 10,000.
Oh,
It's
wow.
a
Okay,
rough
great.
estimate, around the whole state. I mean, because we have communities and we have Filipino American organizations in Shreveport, Alexandria, Lake Charles, Lafayette, Morgan City, Thibodaux, so there are Filipino communities around. Um, and so we there are a number of communities. It's just that there's also this kind of, that the historical marker helped. When we put the historical marker for St. Malo, a lot
Mhm.
of people came out and said, "Oh, I'm Filipino," and so blonde hair, blue eyes, and
Yeah.
it's like, like, or so it's like, because they were claiming this kind of lost kind of ancestry, that they might not have said this earlier, but once you raise the profile of a history, people can start to identify with that history again. And
Mhm.
that's, what I'm trying to do with this project about Filipinos, just like more people just to recognize their ancestors that were Filipino, A lot of people with Spanish names might not know that they had Filipino ancestors.
Yeah, you might be right about that. Well, yeah, I'm sure you probably are. So, Randy, I want to thank you so much for doing this tonight. You can pick up the book at the 1850 House Museum store on Jackson Square. Congratulations on all your amazing work, and we will see everybody talking about George DeRoe next Tuesday at 6 p.m. Thanks so much, Randy.
Thank you.